I want to dive into something of a secondary topic, and I think it would really be I would be really bummed if we didn't talk about this, because I think this is something else that you are extremely good at, and it is less of a part of screenwriting explicitly. You might know what I'm already going towards.
I don't.
But world building, right?
Oh,
setting up, building worlds, not just for screen, not just for screenplays and for films and, universes that you're creating with these stories that you're telling to put on screen, but also with like tabletop RPGs. Like, you run a D&D campaign. You've run now multiple campaigns, and you are an incredible world builder, and you have a knack for creating these vibrant scenes and moving parts and pieces of characters and systems and lore and history and all these things. So how do you think of world building, and how do you approach world building with all your other creative skills?
Well, first off, thank you very much. I really appreciate that coming from you. B, it does kind of just stem back to curiosity or interest. Like, if they're, I think, what I think literally sounds so funny, but I don't know if I've even ever told you this before, but in the one-shot D&D campaign that we did, where I was DMing, we were set in a world called the Halfway. For our listeners, it was a realm that was very like cyberpunk, kind of retro wave kind of feel to it, and I was just super intrigued at that moment. And at the time, I could be wrong. I swear maybe that an underlying thing when I thought of that world is I was listening to The Weeknd's album that came out. It was like 2020. I think maybe just like subconsciously at the time, I was like, oh, I really love the sound of this album, and how would that look visually to me? Mm-hmm. And I knew that this one shot that we were going to do was going to be filled with a bunch of heathens who I love dearly. And so I wanted to make it like Grand Theft Auto. And I think at the time, cyberpunk was like also kind of becoming a thing. I didn't get it or whatever, but it was happening. So if you could create just a city that's like cyberpunk, and you just have your audience who is going to play, have a world where they can just be crazy, go to the club and listen to Tyga's Rack City while other stuff, like, and that's the other thing. You have to have the thing that I found specifically in those D&D campaigns is similarly to directing, which is interesting. It's not necessarily writing, but in managing the tabletop, it's much more of a director where you're collaborating, and you're even though you have the rules of the world and you have the rules of kind of the main beats that you want to get to, mm-hmm. Ultimately, you're working with everyone at the table to allow them to achieve and tell the story that they want to tell. As a director, in a short film, who would I be if I hire a costume designer? And I may have notes, obviously, like I want like a certain look or a certain thing, but after I tell that costume designer like what my inspiration, what the vision is, and we go back and forth on the script, he or she like would have a great idea, and like I would do the thing that would excite them, do the thing that allows them that got them there in the first place or wanted them to have that inspiration. Same thing with tabletops. If a player has a certain idea that they want for their character, I want to try my best to have them do that thing they want to do, because then at that point it's not a collaborative art. And at that point, I think when you get to directing, when you have so many different people at the table on mm-hmm. set, mm-hmm. it becomes more than just the thing on the page. It becomes what team you're building. And I think as someone who has like always loved sports, especially baseball, especially my Padres, I've seen bad teams and I've seen really good teams.
Yeah.
And I think the best teams, it's tougher because film sets, and there's so many different stigmas and how many different ways people run film sets. Some of them, like, they take it very business minded. Some of them are very team oriented. Some of them are like family oriented, which is like, it sounds to me like very lovely. But you also have to understand that there are other people who are just, they're working. That's their job. They don't want to be a part of the family. They don't really care. So you have to curtail your own ideas, your own visions, whatever, to who do you have at the table with you. This is both D&D, but also an analogy for filmmaking and any other thing. Who's with you? It could be music. Who's running who's engineering your song? How are they best utilized? It's, at the end of the day, when that becomes a thing, it's very collaborative. And any art that requires more than just one person, it immediately at some point inherently becomes someone else's thing too. It's not just yours anymore. And I think that the best way to world build and to have people around you at the same time is to allow the players at your table to have the freedom that they want to have. Because without that, then your world you just have a world and it exists.
Yeah.
And it's cool. And maybe I've tangented a little bit and not directly answered the question about world building itself, and kind of morphed it into like how players and characters kind of
you're bringing it back. You're threading it back in.
I'm glad. But at the end of the day, it's about creating something that you feel like the players at your table will respond to. And if it's something that they really enjoy, your audience enjoys. And something that, in the case of D&D, it's interesting because you know your audience, and you know your audience of like 6 or 10 or whoever. And if you can find something that you enjoy, it doesn't mean you have to like send out a Google form to be like, what's your favorite environment? Like, you don't have to do that. Like, be steadfast and think that you're interested in. But if you can fill that world with things that you're interested in, but also allowing your players to find fun in the world. Like, if you have a bunch of science fiction freaks, but you make a world that's like high like classical fantasy set in the olden days, and like people aren't going to have fun.
Yeah.
So you do kind of have to, again, unfortunately, like, you have to know your audience. And if it is a world that you really want to build and create, and you are stuck to that medieval classical fantasy thing, then you, again, like we talked about, you hook them in with like, these are the familiar beats with whatever. But then you shake them up a little bit, and then you're like, oh, this is interesting. I didn't expect that. But then, okay, this is something that I expect. Shake it up a little bit.
Right.
It's interesting.
Oh, it's beyond interesting. And the way that you have drawn parallels between directing and running a tabletop session in D&D or any tabletop RPG, it's so interesting to hear, because your points about collaboration and about, driving the narrative forward and maybe taking ownership of, okay, these are the key points that we need to hit. These are our big milestones. These are the summits. These are the big moments, the ends of every act, right? This is where we need to end up at the end of every act. How we get there is up to you guys. Like, and I'm just here to make sure we're steered in the right direction and we're aiming roughly in the direction of the thing we need to end up at, right? There's a saying, and for listeners, both Justice and I have DM'd campaigns. There's a saying that I really like about DMing, which is, as a DM, your job is to kind of move mountains in the background, right? Where you're always letting your players run and have fun and go in directions that they think are cool. And when they're facing towards one thing, part of your job is making sure that the set is kind of rotating behind them to make sure that the best and the most interesting things are always coming up in ways that keep them engaged, but also that keep the story moving forward. Right.
Yes.
And that's, I love the way you've just drawn a parallel between directing and a set and a tabletop. And to your point, you mentioned knowing your audience, right? And how there's, when you're at a tabletop, you know your audience. I would say, if you can make something that's entertaining to 4 people and captivating to 4 people, you can make something that's entertaining for any moving going crowd. Because when you think about the size of groups that go and see movies, you go and see it with a few friends, you go see it with your family, right? You're maybe up to 4, 5, 6 at most. So I think there's some really sage wisdom in that too, of saying, if you can find a narrative that 6 people will engage with, that's probably going to engage with a lot of people.
I completely agree with you. If you, regardless of the size of who you're doing, like it is a valuable skill to know where your interest in what you want to tell through whatever storytelling method that you want, and then how to apply that and deliver it to a group of 4 to 6 people or thousands of people.
Again, a really cool parallel to be drawn in creative collaboration with letting the other people that come to the story imprint their own fingerprint on the narrative as a whole, and how that adds so much to the picture and so many things that the group without that person, without that collaborator, and thinking about people that show up at tabletop sessions as collaborators, not just, yes, it's the traditional terms are game runner, dungeon master, and players. Really, it's, table collaborators, right? That's really what it breaks down to. And it's, that on film sets, on music projects, it's all, there's a really cool parallel that you've pulled out and really touched on, I think, really well there, which is, I love it. Hey friends, if you liked that clip of the Create Connected podcast, you might like listening to the entire episode using the link on screen.